The events we will bring here are so relevant that regardless of the date you are watching this documentary, it will always remain current. On February 24, 2022, the world stood still as Vladimir Putin made a decision that would change the course of history. Foreseeing all the consequences that would come, the Kremlin adopted a clear strategy to increase its gold reserves and reduce its dependence on the US dollar. This decision was not by chance. Vladimir Putin anticipated that, by moving forward with more aggressive actions on the international scene, Russia would face severe economic sanctions and possible financial instability. Having a robust gold reserve was seen as a way to strengthen the Russian economy against the sanctions that he knew were coming. And there's no denying that Russia's gold accumulation has been impressive. In just a decade, the Russian central bank has more than tripled its reserves, becoming one of the largest gold holders in the world. This strategy was part of a larger effort to ensure Russia's financial sovereignty by avoiding the use of dollars and euros, which would be frozen or confiscated in the event of sanctions. Gold, by its nature, offers protection against any type of external threat, since it is a physical asset, stored on Russian soil, out of direct reach of Western countries. We haven't seen a country accumulate gold reserves so significantly since the end of the gold standard in the 1970s. The gold standard was an international monetary system in which the currencies of various countries were directly linked to the value of gold. This meant that governments guaranteed that their currencies could be converted into a fixed amount of gold. This system was widely used throughout the world until the early 20th century and began to be abandoned after the Great Depression, with the United States officially breaking away from it in 1971. Since then, global economic balance has increasingly depended on the military and political strength of nations. And when we talk about military strength, it is impossible not to think of the current conflict in Ukraine, where many initially expected the Russian military operation to be quick, perhaps even surgical. But reality has shown something completely different. The conflict quickly escalated into a devastating one that has dragged on, marked by intense fighting, incessant shelling and widespread destruction. Thousands of soldiers on both sides have lost their lives, while entire cities in Ukraine have been turned into rubble. Putin's decision has brought suffering not only to Ukrainians, but also to the Russian people, who have seen their country's economy hit by severe international sanctions. As the horrific events drag on, the human cost becomes increasingly clear. It is not only the soldiers on the battlefield who have paid a heavy price for Vladimir Putin's decisions, but also the civilians who, in many cases, had nothing to do with the conflict. Schools, hospitals and homes have been targeted, resulting in thousands of lives lost and millions of people left homeless. Images of families trying to escape the bombings and refugees seeking shelter in other countries have become a sad symbol of the impact of this conflict. However, anyone who thinks that only Ukrainians have suffered from all this is mistaken. In Russia, the situation has not been much different. Economic sanctions have forced the country into financial hardship, and many Russian families are also suffering the pain of losing loved ones on the front lines. There is no doubt that the people of both countries are suffering, but for very different reasons. The Ukrainian people are suffering from the brutality of an invasion of their territory, while the Russian people are facing the anguish of seeing their loved ones sent into a conflict that many believe is pointless. The reality is harsh. The authoritarian decisions of a single man are drastically affecting the lives of millions of people. And of course, for completely senseless reasons. Putin justifies the invasion of Ukraine by claiming that the Ukrainian government is under the control of extremists who persecute the population of Russian origin, especially in the separatist regions of Donetsk and Luhansk in Donbass. According to him, the military action aims to protect these communities and free them from Kiev's alleged oppression. Another crucial point in his justification is NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe, which Putin sees as a direct threat to Russia's security. He claims that the West broke promises not to expand the military alliance after the end of the Cold War, and that Ukraine's possible entry into NATO would create an existential risk for Russia. Furthermore, Putin defends the idea that Russia and Ukraine share a common identity, arguing that Ukraine was artificially separated from Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. For him, Ukraine has always been an integral part of the great Russian nation. He also justifies the invasion as a preemptive measure to prevent Western weapons from being deployed in Ukraine, which he says would pose a direct threat to Russia's territorial integrity. And of course, Putin also claims the need to protect the Russian language and culture, accusing the Ukrainian government of trying to eliminate Russian identity in the country. Well, my friends, the geopolitical scenario has always been marked by the creation of narratives used to justify tyrannies. And this is nothing new. Throughout history, we have seen this repeatedly. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began on February 24, 2022, but the conflict between the two countries has been unfolding since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and fighting began in eastern Ukraine. It was in the midst of this escalation that Vladimir Putin made a decision that would drastically change the course of events. He announced the mobilization of 300,000 Russian men to fight in Ukraine. This was the first time since World War II that mass mobilization had been declared in Russia, demonstrating the seriousness with which the Kremlin was taking the conflict. However, the decision was met with fierce resistance. Protests broke out in several Russian cities, and many young people tried to leave the country to avoid conscription. This internal discontent highlighted that, despite the government's efforts to control the narrative and maintain popular support, there were cracks in public trust. The mobilization of troops, the losses on the battlefield, the devastation of cities and the impact on the economies of both countries are just some examples of how Putin's decision to invade Ukraine triggered a series of events that continue to shape the lives of millions of people, both in Russia and Ukraine. The announcement of the mobilization of 300,000 men took many Russians by surprise and was felt immediately. As soon as the news spread throughout the country, fear of being sent to fight on the front lines took hold of a large part of the Russian population. Suddenly, the feeling of insecurity caused thousands of people to look for a way to avoid mandatory conscription. Panic spread, and along with it, a wave of young people began to leave the country in a hurry. Those who could, rushed to the airports. Flight prices out of Russia skyrocketed. Within hours, once affordable tickets became luxury items. In some cases, one-way tickets cost more than 9,000 euros, an unthinkable price for most Russians, since that represented more than half of the average annual salary in the country. Even so, many were willing to pay any price to avoid the possibility of being drafted into the conflict. Airlines quickly sold out of available flights, and given the high demand, several countries began restricting the entry of Russian citizens, making escape even more difficult. For those who could not afford the exorbitant prices of airfare, the only option was to take land routes. Mile-long lines of cars began to form at the borders with countries such as Georgia and Kazakhstan, places that still allowed Russians to enter without a visa. The scenes of long lines and even people trying to cross the border on foot, carrying suitcases and essential belongings, reflected the desperation of those seeking any alternative to escape the war. Inside Russia, the sense of normalcy that the government had tried to maintain began to crumble. The conflict, which had once seemed distant to many, was now closer than ever. The mass mobilization transformed the lives of millions of Russians, especially those directly drafted. However, the side effects of this decision echoed throughout society. Entire families were affected, as parents, children and siblings faced the fear of being sent to the borders with the Ukrainians. Many young people, especially from urban areas and the upper classes, protested or sought ways to avoid military service. The psychological impact is devastating. Uncertainty about the future is becoming unbearable for millions of people. Discontent, although repressed by the government, is evident in the demonstrations that continue to erupt in several cities, resulting in thousands of arrests. Censorship and state propaganda attempt to suppress dissatisfaction, but the cracks in public trust are already exposed. The fear of involuntary conscription, coupled with the perception that the conflict could drag on for a long time, is creating a climate of constant anxiety throughout the country. In the early days of the invasion, many countries, especially in Europe and North America, closed their airspace to Russian flights, making escape by air extremely limited. With few options available, remaining flights quickly became scarce and unaffordable. Only two European airlines, Air Serbia and Turkish Airlines, continued to operate flights to Russia, causing ticket prices to skyrocket to levels that were too high for most of the population. The situation became even more serious when neighboring countries that had traditionally maintained open borders began to strictly control the flow of Russians. Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia and Finland were quick to close their land borders, leaving Russians with even fewer options for leaving. As escape options became increasingly scarce, many were forced to resort to unconventional, and even dangerous, routes to avoid conscription. With traditional routes blocked and flight prices skyrocketing, those looking to escape had to get creative. Some opted for longer, more expensive routes, flying to countries that still accepted flights from Russia, and then trying to make it to their final destination. Others braved the long lines at the borders with Georgia and Kazakhstan, risking crossing before those countries closed their doors as well. Within Russia, tensions were rising by the day. The war, which was already devastating Ukraine, was now taking its toll on the Russian side as well. Restrictions on movement and the difficulties in finding an escape route reinforced the feeling of imprisonment and despair among a population that, with each new announcement of mobilization, saw its freedoms further curtailed. As Russians faced increasing obstacles to leaving the country, the weight of international sanctions began to be felt even more acutely within Russia. In response to the invasion, an unprecedented wave of economic sanctions was imposed by several nations, aimed at isolating Vladimir Putin's government and forcing it to reconsider its actions. The consequences of these measures quickly affected every sector of the economy, from trade to energy, exposing the fragility of a system that had previously seemed resilient to external pressures. The United States, the European Union and their allies have taken a coordinated approach to cutting off Russia's access to the global financial system. One of the most significant sanctions was the exclusion of Russian banks from the SWIFT system, which is essential for international financial transactions. The SWIFT system is a global network that facilitates secure communication between banks and other financial institutions in different countries. It acts as a sort of messenger for international transactions, allowing banks to send and receive information about payments, money transfers and other transactions in a standardized way. Without this connection, Russia was virtually disconnected from the global economy, which made it extremely difficult for businesses and citizens to move capital. Transferring money abroad or making international payments became a monumental challenge, affecting everyone from large exporters to small businesses that relied on external transactions. Many Russians have had to turn to cryptocurrencies as a way to get around these restrictions. Cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin offer a decentralized and difficult-to-control way for governments or banks to transfer money internationally without having to go through traditional banking systems like SWIFT. The energy sector, vital to the Kremlin's revenues, has also been hit hard. The West has severely restricted purchases of Russian oil and natural gas, a crucial source of government funding. Companies such as Gazprom and Rosneft, which had previously dominated the global energy market, have seen their revenues plummet as exports to Europe have collapsed. This has forced Russia to seek new buyers to stay afloat, mainly China and India, but at prices far below global standards, in a desperate attempt to minimize losses. In addition to the financial and energy sanctions, the departure of famous Western companies from the country was a devastating blow to the daily lives of the Russian population. Brands that were part of everyone's daily life, such as McDonald's, Starbucks and Apple, closed their doors, while automotive giants such as Ford and Toyota ceased operations in the country. The departure of these companies not only left a void in the market, but also took away the livelihoods of thousands of workers. For many, the emotional impact was as great as the economic one, as these brands symbolized a connection to the outside world, which now seemed to be growing increasingly distant. As companies left and businesses shut down, inflationary effects soon set in. The price of basic foodstuffs, clothing, and medicine soared, while imported goods disappeared from the shelves, creating a climate of scarcity that Russia had not seen since the hardest days of the Soviet Union. For the population, the cost of living rose dramatically, and already fragile personal savings lost value as the ruble depreciated. Inflation quickly eroded Russians' purchasing power, forcing many to face a daily life of uncertainty. The psychological impact of this reality cannot be ignored either. What once seemed like a distant conflict, involving only the Ukrainian borders, now had a direct impact on the pockets and lives of millions of Russians. With each new announcement of military mobilization and sanctions, the feeling of isolation and frustration grew. Discontent, despite the government's efforts to control the internal narrative, was evident in small riots and growing distrust among the population. Gradually, it became clear that the war in Ukraine was not just a burden for Ukrainians, but a bitter reality that began to suffocate the Russian people themselves. As the forced mobilization progressed, discontent within Russia grew rapidly. Worried about being sent to the front, many Russians began to openly express their dissatisfaction. The toll of human losses and the separation of families made it clear that the cost of the war was taking its toll. But the discontent was not confined to the popular demonstrations on the streets, it began to seep into the very foundations of Putin's regime, threatening to undermine the domestic support that had previously seemed unshakable. One of the clearest signs that discontent was spreading was the mutiny by the Wagner Group, a Russian mercenary force led by Yevgeny Prigozhin. In a bold move, the group attempted to defy the government, advancing toward Moscow in an act of rebellion that left many Russians stunned. Although the attempted takeover was quickly quelled, it exposed significant fissures within the Russian security elite and showed that even close allies of Putin were questioning the direction of affairs. Shortly thereafter, news of Prigozhin's death in a plane crash raised many suspicions and theories. For many, it was a clear message that the Kremlin would not hesitate to silence anyone who spoke out against it, even those who had been allies. This episode not only heightened the feeling of insecurity among Russians, but also caused more people to begin to question the stability of Putin's government. On the streets, protests against the war and forced mobilization continued, despite the government's efforts to silence any opposition with violence and mass arrests. Even under heavy repression, discontent grew. The losses on the battlefield and the call-up of thousands of young people to the front lines created a climate of fear and uncertainty. At the same time, economic hardships were increasing dramatically. As international sanctions tightened, inflation soared, the price of food and basic goods rose rapidly, and many goods began to disappear from the shelves. For most Russians, the future looked increasingly bleak, with no clear signs of improvement. This crisis scenario fueled growing distrust in Putin's government. More and more people sought to distance themselves from the Kremlin's decisions, either by trying to leave the country in search of safety or by supporting, albeit discreetly, opposition movements. Even in private conversations and on social media, where the government tried to maintain control, discontent began to show. The invasion, which was initially presented as a defense of Russian interests, is now seen by many as the root of all the troubles. The impact on daily life, with families separated, the economy collapsing and widespread uncertainty, is destroying the confidence of large parts of the population in the future and in Putin's regime itself. Vladimir Putin has been in power for more than 2 decades. He first assumed the presidency on December 31, 1999, when then-President Boris Yeltsin resigned and named him his successor. Putin worked in the KGB, the Soviet Union's main intelligence agency, and then in Russian politics, where he quickly gained Yeltsin's trust. Putin was officially elected president in 2000 and has maintained a firm grip on the country ever since. He served 2 consecutive terms until 2008, but because the Russian constitution did not allow for 3 consecutive terms, Putin installed his close ally, Dmitry Medvedev, as president while he took over as prime minister. During this period, it was clear that he continued to wield the greatest political influence in the country. In 2012, Putin returned to the presidency, following changes to the constitution that extended the presidential term to 6 years. He was re-elected in 2018, further consolidating his power. Under his leadership, Russia has become more authoritarian, with tighter control over the media, repression of opponents and restrictions on political freedoms. Over the years, Putin has been centralizing power, eliminating political opposition and expanding his control over key economic and military sectors. His image as a leader who defends national interests has helped him maintain the support of a significant portion of the population. But with everything that has happened, this scenario is changing rapidly. In addition to the harsh economic and political consequences, Russia began to feel the weight of increasing cultural isolation. With the invasion of Ukraine, the country was quickly excluded from many international artistic collaborations and events. Film festivals, art exhibitions and theater performances, which previously had Russian presence, completely cut ties with Russian artists and institutions. International cultural organizations have shunned any association with Russia, and once globally acclaimed Russian artists have faced barriers to performing abroad. Productions involving Russian directors, writers and musicians have been cancelled or postponed indefinitely. The cultural impact also extended to the world of sports. Russian athletes, who had once been proud to represent their nation on the global stage, now faced a series of restrictions. International competitions such as football championships, tennis tournaments, and even Olympic events were imposed with bans or severe limitations. Many athletes were forced to compete without the Russian flag, and in other cases, were banned from participating altogether. For many athletes, this meant the end of their international careers, with opportunities for medals and global recognition abruptly taken away. This cultural and sporting isolation has plunged the Russian people into a new level of frustration. Accustomed to seeing Russia as a key player in the global art and sporting scene, many Russians now feel disconnected, marginalized and rejected by the rest of the world. This exclusion has only increased the feeling of powerlessness in a country already reeling from economic sanctions, compounding the sense of isolation and the psychological impact of the war on its population, who see their nation increasingly removed from any global normality. Looking ahead, the conflict in Ukraine and the resulting international isolation indicate that Russia may face a number of profound and long-lasting challenges. The war, which has already brought untold devastation and suffering, could leave long-term scars not only on the countries directly involved, but also on Russia's own internal stability. Continued hostilities and prolonged international sanctions could further exacerbate the economic crisis, leading to a spiral of runaway inflation, rising unemployment, and an increasingly unsustainable cost of living for the Russian population. Rapidly growing social discontent is another critical issue. Forced mobilization, heavy battlefield losses, and cultural isolation are fueling widespread discontent that could challenge Vladimir Putin's rule as never before. While the Kremlin has tried to maintain control through repression, censorship, and the use of force, this discontent is deep-rooted, not only among ordinary citizens but also among figures who have traditionally supported the regime. The recent deaths of dissident figures such as Yevgeny Prigozhin, as well as signs of disloyalty within the government's own ranks, reveal increasingly visible cracks in the political system that Putin has built over decades. On the international stage, Russia's isolation continues to deepen. The country's withdrawal from global cultural and sporting events, coupled with economic sanctions, is widening the gap between Moscow and the rest of the world. This distancing not only affects Russia's image abroad, but also limits its options for building or maintaining strategic alliances, impacting its trade and diplomatic relations. With fewer partners willing to collaborate, Russia's influence on global affairs continues to weaken, reducing its presence in arenas it once occupied with prominence. The future of this conflict and the consequences for Russia are undoubtedly uncertain. However, one thing is clear: the chosen path, marked by war and isolation, could lead the country to a long period of economic, social and political instability. And to complicate matters further for Russia, the country may be strengthening a major temporary ally that could soon become its greatest enemy, China. Increasingly dependent on Chinese oil and gas sales due to Western sanctions, Russia is fueling an economy that could turn against Putin's country in the very near future. You can watch the full story in the upcoming documentary here on GlobalFlow, which is now available on your screen. See you there.